They found his teeth before they found his name. Blood pooled beneath the frozen truck, like spilled wine on concrete. The door hung ajar, letting in the January wind, whispering over a body that no longer breathed. The ice on his fingers hadn't yet melted, his final moments captured in a frostbitten grimace. No witnesses. No clues. Just one signature left behind, a single silver coin tucked behind the corpse's ear. The police officer turned pale when he saw it. He whispered, "It's him." Richard Kuklinski had struck again. But who was he really? Beneath the myth and shadows, was he a cold-blooded killer or a man made by monsters? Before the newspapers called him the Iceman, before the mob gave him orders, Richard was a boy hiding from fists in the walls of a broken home. This was no random killing. It was a message. To the mob. To the police. To anyone who ever doubted his reach. Kuklinski didn't just destroy his enemies, he erased them from memory. This was not murder. This was performance. Precision. The first act of a deadly symphony. Before the blood, before the headlines, he was just a kid no one noticed. Richard Kuklinski walked invisible through hallways at school, bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. He spoke rarely. When he did, his voice trembled like he was still waiting for something to hit him. His teachers called him slow. His classmates called him strange. But no one saw the rage gathering like storm clouds behind his silence. Richard learned it early that mercy was for the weak, and kindness always came with bruises. One night, when the beating stopped and the house went quiet, Richard stared at the ceiling and made a vow. "They won't hurt me again," he whispered to the dark. That night, something inside him cracked, and something colder took its place. It started small. A pushback. A single punch thrown too hard in the schoolyard. A kid didn't get up. Then, another. The teachers thought it was an accident. Richard said nothing. But each time, it felt easier. Cleaner. More control. He'd found something no one could take from him. Power. At home, his father still screamed and hit. But Richard didn't flinch anymore. He'd go to the basement and stare into the dark, imagining silence. Not peace. Just silence. It was the only thing that made him feel safe. The first real kill wasn't for money. It wasn't for revenge. It was because the man insulted him in a bar. Slurred words. A shove. Richard didn't think. He just acted. Later, he stood over the body in an alley, breath fogging in the cold air. No one saw it. No one cared. And nothing inside him felt different. No guilt. No panic. Only calm. That's when he realized, for the first time in his life, he had control. Words spread slowly, like rumors crawling through shadowed streets. "Don't cross him, don't talk back, don't even look too long." Richard didn't have a nickname yet. He didn't need one. The mob noticed him, not for charm or smarts but for silence. He didn't brag. He didn't warn. He just finished things. And in that quiet executioner's code, the families found something useful. They didn't know where he lived. He never dined with them. But when something needed to disappear, they called one name. Kuklinski. Before he was a name whispered by killers, Richard Kuklinski was just a young man trying to survive. He met Barbara in a diner off 8th Avenue, where she worked night shifts and served coffee to men who never smiled. She didn't smile either, not until Richard, then in his early 20s, left her a tip wrapped in a paper crane. "You always look tired," he said once. She replied, "So do you." They never spoke of love. They didn't need to. It was in the way he walked her home, the way she touched his arm, and didn't flinch. For the first time, Richard felt human. With Barbara, he believed he could be normal. He could forget the fists, the blood, the ice. They married quietly. No rings, no guests, just the city and a promise. But shadows followed him home. He didn't tell her what he did for money. She didn't ask. Maybe she knew. Maybe she chose not to know. But beneath their kitchen lights, he was just a man trying to be enough. He tried to build a life around the lies. A house in the suburbs. A backyard. A dog for the kids. From the outside they looked like anyone else. Richard mowed the lawn. Took his daughters to church. Told bedtime stories with a voice that barely trembled. But every time he heard a siren, his heart paused. Every knock at the door sounded like judgment. Still, Barbara clung to hope. "You've changed," she said one morning. Richard kissed her forehead and whispered, "I try." But even he didn't believe it. In the basement, where the lights never reached, he kept reminders of the man he used to be. Guns, knives, chains, and silence. It was his temple, his cold church, a shrine to the part of him that never left. Barbara knew something was wrong when the bruises stopped making sense. When Richard came home, clean but distant. When money appeared in thick envelopes with no return address. She asked once, "What do you do?" He looked at her with dead eyes and said, "I protect the family." That was all. No yelling. No explanation. Just those words. And she never asked again. But questions lived in her silence. In the way she triple-locked the doors. In how she checked the news each morning for names she might recognize. Loving Richard meant burying her doubt and pretending the man who held her wasn't made of shadows. Richard's daughters saw a different man. He wasn't gentle, but he wasn't cruel. He was strict, protective, unshakable. To them, he was a mountain, silent, towering, and immovable. He made them promise never to answer the door when he wasn't home. He taught them to memorize exit routes, just in case. "Bad men are real," he said once. "But they'll never touch you." The girls didn't understand. Not fully. But they believed him. And that belief made Richard feel like something more than what he was. When they hugged him, he felt almost human again. Almost. Every time Richard killed, he told himself it was to keep them safe. Every bullet fired, every throat slit, it was all to protect the illusion he'd built. But the line between love and violence blurred fast. The more he worked, the colder he became. He'd leave for days, sometimes weeks. Come back with new scars, new silences. Barbara would ask, "Is it over?" And he'd nod. But it never was. Richard wasn't protecting them. He was protecting the version of himself that they loved. And deep down he feared the day they'd see the monster under the mask. Because once they did, there would be no going back. The jobs started coming faster. More dangerous. Dirtier. The families trusted Richard because he never asked questions. He just got it done. No threats. No warnings. Just silence, followed by disappearance. But with each kill, he felt less. Not empty, just numb. Like his soul had thickened into leather. He'd walk into a room with a name, and walk out with silence. No witnesses. No mistakes. He didn't enjoy it. But he didn't hate it either. It was a craft. A calling. And he was becoming a legend. Men in suits whispered over drinks, "Kuklinski's the real thing." The police had no leads. The bodies were dumped like afterthoughts, frozen, clean, untraceable. Richard didn't leave fingerprints. He left fear. And that fear began to echo louder than any evidence ever could. The first mistake came wrapped in a suit. A mid-level mobster named Salvatore. Too loud. Too careless. He tried to cut Richard short on payment, thought he could intimidate him. "I don't pay dogs extra," he said. Richard didn't argue. He didn't speak. He just waited. Days later, Salvatore's body was found in his car, hands bound, mouth sealed shut with tape, and a thermometer protruding from his neck, frozen solid. The message was brutal and clear. You don't cheat the Iceman. From that point on, there were no negotiations. No delays. Richard's silence became more terrifying than any threat. He didn't need reputation anymore. He had myth. The mob began using him for the unspeakable. Witnesses that needed erasing. Messages that had to bleed. But they kept him at arm's length. He was never invited to weddings. Never called family. Richard noticed, but he didn't care. Trust was dangerous. Emotions were liabilities. He lived in the space between deals and disappearances. He had rules. No women. No children. But sometimes rules blurred. Once, a job involved a man hiding with his teenage son. Richard stood over the boy, gun drawn, and then walked away. Later he told the client the job was done. It wasn't. A rare mercy, wrapped in a lie. Even monsters have lines. But mercy comes with consequences. The boy wasn't silent. The lie rippled. Whispers reached the wrong ears. Richard's handler, a mob fixer named Carmine, pulled him aside. "You're getting soft," he said. Richard just stared at him. Carmine added, "That's dangerous in our business." It wasn't a warning, it was a test. And Richard knew what came next. He had a choice. Kill the boy and prove loyalty, or disappear. The line between killer and target had never been thinner. Richard realized that even the myth of the Iceman wasn't untouchable. If you faltered, you became the job. That night, Richard went for a drive with no destination. Snow fell softly across the windshield, blurring streetlights like ghosts. He thought of his daughters, of Barbara, of the boy he spared. The car was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the radio. Somewhere between the past and the present, he felt something he hadn't in years: doubt. Not regret. Not guilt. Just the realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd lost control. And in his world, control was everything. Without it you were already dead. So he pulled over, gripped a steering wheel, and whispered to the dark, "No more mistakes." Because in the life he built, there was no room for second chances. It started with a look. Barbara caught Richard on the phone late one night whispering, eyes locked on the hallway door. When she asked who it was, he said, "Business." But something in his voice cracked. For the first time she didn't believe him. The next morning, she found a burner phone beneath his truck seat. She didn't confront him. She just watched. Noticed how often he disappeared. How his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. One night, she followed him. Not far. Just enough to see him meet a man she didn't recognize, tall, wiry government heir. That's when the real fear sank in. Richard wasn't just hiding from the mob. He was hiding from something bigger. And Barbara began to wonder if the man she married even existed anymore. The man in the trench coat had a name: Dominic. He wasn't with the mob. He was FBI. And he'd been watching Kuklinski for months. "You're a ghost," he said during their first meeting. But even ghosts leave footprints. Dominic made an offer. Immunity, protection for his family, a clean slate. In exchange, Kuklinski had to talk. He had to betray every name he'd ever worked for. Richard didn't say yes. But he didn't say no either. For the first time, someone had found leverage. And deep down Dominic knew. It wasn't guilt that would sway him. It was Barbara. The girls. Because monsters don't fear bullets. They fear losing the only pieces of light they have left. Back in the city, the whispers began. Someone was talking. Carmine heard it first. "We got a leak," he muttered, staring at a lit cigarette as if it held answers. Panic swept through the ranks. Men turned on each other. Files vanished. Phone numbers changed. Richard played dumb. He kept his distance. But the tension was bleeding into his home. Barbara noticed the loaded gun on the nightstand. The way he flinched at small sounds. One night she asked, "Are we safe?" Richard didn't answer. He just closed the bedroom door and sat in the dark. Alone. The Iceman wasn't just hunted now, he was cornered. And cornered men make desperate choices. Barbara found the wire in his coat pocket. The transmitter was small, hidden in a stitched seam. She held it like a rattlesnake. When he came home, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply said, "Is it for them? Or for me?" Richard froze. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. She whispered, "I love you when you were just broken. I stayed when you turned to stone. But this is betrayal." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. Distance between them, measured in silence, cut deeper than any knife. And for the first time, Richard knew what true pain felt like. Not physical, not violent, just the hollow ache of being truly alone. The FBI moved fast. They had tapes, logs, partial confessions, enough to bring down half the East Coast mob. But Dominic wanted more. He wanted the monster on record. Richard sat in a soundproof room, lights humming overhead. "Let's begin," Dominic said, pressing record. And Richard spoke. Calm, dead-ear, precise. No theatrics. Just names, dates, methods. 35 confirmed kills. Dozens unconfirmed. "Did you feel anything?" Dominic asked once. Richard looked him dead in the eye and said, "Less than nothing." That moment sealed it. There was no redemption. No misunderstood soul. Just a man who embraced the cold and left a trail of bodies in his frost-bitten wake. The moment the tapes hit the streets, everything burned. Carmine vanished. Safe houses were torched. Men who once ruled blocks disappeared overnight. The families declared open war. One of them even put a bounty on Richard's head, $500,000 for the Iceman, dead or alive. The hunter had become prey. Richard didn't flinch. He shaved his beard, changed plates, burned his own photos. But this wasn't fear. It was focus. He knew the final game was coming. And in that quiet rage he made a list, not of enemies but of loose ends. People who knew too much. Places he had to bury. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about legacy. "If I go down," he said to himself, "I take the silence with me." They came at night. 2 cars. 4 men. All armed. They knew his routine. Knew he'd be alone. But Richard wasn't a target. He was a trap. As they broke into the basement, he was already behind them. No words. Just gunfire, silence, and blood on concrete. When it ended, only Richard stood. His breath slow, steady. One man still alive, crawling, choking. Richard knelt beside him. "Tell them," he whispered. "You found death in the dark." Then he walked away. That house, that life, everything. He left it all behind. The fire that night wasn't just for the bodies. It was for the past. He was burning the man he used to be. Barbara fled with the girls that same night. No note. No goodbye. Just silence. She didn't need closure. She needed distance. Richard watched from a nearby payphone as they disappeared into the highway fog. He didn't cry. He didn't blink. He just stood there until the line went cold. Love had never been enough. Not for him, not for the life he lived. And now, the only thing that mattered had chosen to survive without him. That loss didn't scream. It whispered. It echoed in the stillness. He was free now. Free to finish what he started. But freedom had never felt this empty. The last name on his list was Carmine. The man who built him. The man who tried to bury him. Richard found him hiding in a beach house, surrounded by bodyguards and fear. But Kuklinski didn't kick down the door. He waited. Days. Studied patterns. Until one night, as the guards played poker, Richard slipped in through the garage. He moved like death, unseen until it was too late. Carmine was in the kitchen, reheating pasta. When he turned, Richard was already there. "You made me," Richard said. "Now I unmake you." The shot echoed across the water. One bullet, It. One truth. One. Richard wasn't just a product. He was evolution. Richard drove for hours after the shot. No destination. Just motion. The city shrank behind him. The past dissolved with every mile. Somewhere near the state line, he pulled over. Snow fell like ash. He stepped out, looked up at the empty sky and whispered, "It's done." But it wasn't. Because no matter how far he ran, his name still echoed. In mob circles, behind pissed upstain. In FBI files. In the nightmares of the few who lived. He was no longer a man. He was a myth wrapped in ice and gunpowder. The Iceman had no grave. No goodbye. Just cold roads and silence. And that's exactly how he wanted it. They caught him buying toys for Christmas. Not guns. Not ides. Toys. A last-minute run, bags of presents tucked under his arm. When the agents swarmed, Richard didn't resist. He raised his hands and said, "Don't scare the kids." It was almost laughable, the Iceman caught at a Toys R Us. But that's how legends fall. Not in gunfights. In mundane moments. He was cuffed in silence, eyes locked on the snow, beginning to fall outside. The agents whispered to each other. "That's him," one said. "That's Kuklinski." But Richard didn't look like a killer. He looked like a father who knew the holiday was over. And in a way, it was. For good. The trial was brutal. The courtroom became a theater of horror. Prosecutors read his list aloud like a funeral dirge. Names, dates, methods. The gallery gasped. Reporters scribbled like vultures. Richard just sat there, emotionless. His lawyer tried to spin him as misunderstood, a victim of trauma. But the tapes crushed that lie. "I didn't feel anything," Richard said in one recording. "It was just what I did." There was no outburst. No apology. Just quiet. When the sentence came, life stacked until death, he didn't flinch. He simply nodded, like it was inevitable. Like he'd been living that sentence for years already. Prison didn't change him. It confirmed what he already knew. That walls don't make cages, people do. He kept to himself. No fights. No favors. Just silence. The guards called him the ghost. Inmates gave him space. Even murderers feared the man who felt nothing. He read books. Wrote letters that were never mailed. Sometimes he'd sit by the window in the yard and just watch the sky, as if waiting for something that would never come. When asked if he missed his family, he said, "They're safer without me." And that was it. No stories. No regrets. Just acceptance. Cold, quiet, and final. Years later, a reporter came to interview him. She asked the question everyone wanted to ask. "Do you feel remorse?" Richard smirked. "For what?" She pushed again. "For the lives?" He leaned forward. "I feel sorry for the ones who thought I was their friend." The silence that followed was heavier than chains. The Iceman wasn't searching for redemption. He wasn't rewriting his legacy. He was preserving it. In that steel cage, with the cameras rolling, he became more than a man. He became myth again. Not the kind built from sympathy, but from fear. The kind that never fades. In the end, it wasn't bullets or betrayal that killed him. It was heart failure. The monster who'd ended lives in silence died the same way, alone, in a prison hospital bed, IV tubes buzzing softly. No visitors. No last rites. Just cold machines and colder walls. The guards found him slumped forward, eyes half closed. Even death didn't want to make a sound around him. His body was buried without fanfare. No name etched in stone. No mourners. Just a number in a file. But his story, it lives. In whispers. In nightmares. In the silence before a scream. Because Richard Kuklinski didn't just kill people, he erased them. And when he left, he erased himself. After his death, the tapes resurfaced. Hundreds of hours. Confessions. Cold analysis. No remorse. Documentaries called him the Iceman. Psychologists called him a psychopath. But none of those labels captured the stillness in his voice, the way he spoke of life and death as equal things. People watched in disbelief. Some were fascinated, others horrified. Yet beneath the interviews, behind the dead eyes and flat tone, was something even more chilling: certainty. Richard never doubted what he was. Never pleaded for forgiveness. In a world full of masks, he wore his like skin. And that terrified everyone. Because it meant monsters don't always hide. Sometimes they sit across from you. Calm. Distant. Smiling. Human. Wa. Barbara never gave an interview. Never wrote a book. She changed her name, moved far away, raised the girls in silence. They asked about their father. She told them, "He really loved you, that's enough." But on some nights she'd sit alone with a cigarette and stare out the window, wondering if any of it had been real. The dinners, the laughter, the warmth before the storm. Maybe he did love them. Maybe that was the only piece of humanity he had left. Or maybe he just wore love the same way he wore silence, like a weapon. The mob didn't speak his name again. Not out of fear, but out of shame. He had broken their rules, exposed their secrets, and reminded them that control is always an illusion. To them, Richard wasn't a soldier. He was a virus, spreading silence, killing trust. His legend became cautionary. New recruits were warned with a single line: "Don't end up like Kuklinski." But even in their fear, they respected the efficiency, the discipline, the absolute coldness. Because deep down they knew he hadn't betrayed them. He'd simply outgrown them. Years later, a detective found one last tape. Unmarked. Buried in evidence storage. On it, Richard spoke to no one, just the recorder. His voice was soft. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. Good. Don't cry. Don't wonder. I did what I did, and I did it well." A pause. Then the final words: "We all serve something. I served silence." The detective played it twice, then locked it away again. Because some truths aren't meant for justice. They're meant to haunt. And this one would echo forever. There's no grave to visit. No stone with his name. Just a number. But the legend of Richard Kuklinski lives in the cold places of memory. In the silence before a hit. In the fear behind locked doors. He wasn't the devil. He wasn't misunderstood. He was the consequence. Born in violence. Forged in pain. Sharpened by betrayal. And when he finally disappeared, the world didn't sigh in relief. It held its breath, unsure if he'd ever really left. Because the Iceman didn't need to live forever. He only needed to be remembered. Quietly. Coldly. Always.